I stood frozen in my doorway, grocery bags heavy in my arms, as a stranger measured my living room. The realtor, slim, in a tailored suit, looked up from her clipboard and smiled as if I were the visitor. "Oh, you must be the mother? Don't worry, your son explained everything. We're just doing a preliminary assessment before listing. The assisted living facility requires proof you have sufficient assets for the premium care package." Peaches tumbled from my bag, bruising against the hardwood floor I'd polished yesterday. Ice water flooded my veins, fingertips instantly numb while heat burned up my neck to my cheeks. For 32 years, I had commanded classrooms with quiet authority, guided thousands of students through English literature and contract law. Now I stood mute, a stranger in my own $200,000 home that I had paid off entirely with my teacher's salary. "I'm sorry," I managed finally, my voice emerging higher than normal, lacking the resonant teacher's tone I'd cultivated over decades. "There must be some misunderstanding. I haven't agreed to sell my home." The realtor's eyebrows arched. "Oh, that's awkward. Your son Craig said this was all arranged. He has the paperwork here somewhere." She gestured toward my dining room, where folders spread across the table my late husband and I had chosen 20 years ago. My throat constricted as if invisible hands were tightening around my neck. That hollow feeling I recognized from my husband's death 15 years ago spread through my stomach, the physical sensation of foundation giving way beneath me. I had felt it when the doctor said terminal, and I felt it now, standing in the entryway of the home where I had raised my son alone after cancer took his father. "Perhaps I should call Craig," the realtor said, reaching for her phone. "That won't be necessary." My voice had dropped, almost to a whisper. "I'll speak with my son directly." I moved woodenly into my kitchen, set down the remaining groceries, and stepped through the back door into my garden. For decades, this plot had been my sanctuary. Once barren dirt, now transformed into a vibrant tapestry of plants. The scent of soil after recent rain filled my nostrils, normally comforting, but now turning my stomach as realization bloomed like a poisonous flower. Craig appeared at the garden gate, his expression shifting from surprise to practiced concern. I now recognized as counterfeit. "Mom, you're home early." "Yes," I said, noting how he blocked the entrance to my garden, as if I were trespassing. "I met your realtor." He sighed, rubbing his temple with 2 fingers, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when caught in a lie. "I wanted to ease you into this. Nicole and I found this wonderful place, Oak Ridge Assisted Living. They have an opening, but we needed to move quickly." "An opening?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "We've put down a $3,000 non-refundable deposit to hold your spot. The thing is," he continued, stepping closer, voice dropping as if sharing a confidence rather than orchestrating my removal, "they need proof you have assets to cover the premium care package. The house will more than cover it." The house. My house. The home I had maintained through a teacher's salary while raising him alone, working extra summer sessions to afford the mortgage, the garden I had cultivated from nothing, all dismissed as assets to fund my warehousing. "Craig, this is my home. I have no intention of moving to assisted living. I'm only 67. His expression shifted to his patient face, eyebrows slightly raised, head tilted, the look he gave when explaining something to someone he considered slow to understand. "Mom, we've noticed signs of confusion lately. The misplaced reading glasses, the forgotten lunch date with Nicole's mother. It's better to arrange things now than wait for a crisis." I felt my body automatically shrinking in his presence, shoulders hunching, chin lowering. When had I started making myself smaller around my own son? When had I started to doubt myself through his eyes? I remembered standing before unruly classrooms, maintaining what my students called the Reynolds freeze, that moment of strategic silence before addressing disruption. I straightened my spine, squared my shoulders, and said nothing for 20 seconds. Craig shifted his weight, tugged at his collar as dampness appeared at his neck. "I see," I finally said, measuring each word. "How interesting you think that." Nicole appeared behind him, her designer watch catching the sunlight. "Craig, your mother is here," she stated the obvious with thinly veiled irritation. "The realtor has questions about the square footage." She barely glanced at me as she spoke. I had become your mother, discussed in the third person even in my presence. The woman who had hosted 20 Thanksgiving dinners for her, who had hemmed her wedding dress when the boutique quoted an outrageous fee, reduced to an inconvenient obstacle. "Nicole," I said quietly, "perhaps you could explain why you're selling my home without consulting me." Nicole exchanged a quick glance with Craig, the micro-coordination of practiced conspirators. "Vivian, we've discussed this several times. You just don't remember. This is exactly why these arrangements are necessary." The gaslighting hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't forgotten any discussions because they had never happened. I'd been experiencing the ordinary memory lapses that accompany age, misplaced glasses, occasional word retrieval delays, nothing remotely approaching cognitive decline. Yet they were weaponizing these normal occurrences to justify taking control of my life. "I think you should both leave," I said, my teacher's voice finally emerging, lower and steadier. "Mom, this is ridiculous. We're trying to help you," Craig said, the exasperation matching the time I'd caught him skipping school at 16. "Let me be perfectly clear," I said, each word distinct and measured. "This is my home. I paid for it. I maintain it. I have no cognitive impairment. I am not moving to assisted living, and I am not selling this house." I maintained my stance, chin slightly raised, shoulders squared, the posture that had commanded respect from generations of high school students. But Craig merely sighed, sharing another loaded glance with Nicole. "We'll discuss this when you're calmer," he said, patting my arm as if soothing a child. "It's a big change." "I understand. But Mom, this is happening. The sooner you accept it, the easier the transition will be." As they walked away, I heard Nicole whisper, "See what I mean? The mood swings, the confusion, it's getting worse." I stood alone in my garden, surrounded by plants I had nurtured from seeds, feeling as if the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand. In that moment, I faced an impossible choice: sign away my autonomy to keep peace with my only child, or fight and potentially lose him forever. What I didn't realize then, as I watched them return to my dining room to continue planning my displacement, was that I had already lost him. Or rather, lost the son I thought I had. What remained was a man who saw me as a problem to solve rather than a person to respect. "We'll discuss this when you're calmer," he said, patting my arm as if soothing a child. "It's a big change, I understand. But Mom, this is happening. The sooner you accept it, the easier the transition will be." As they walked away, I heard Nicole whisper, "See what I mean? The mood swings, the confusion, it's getting worse." I stood alone in my garden, surrounded by plants I had nurtured from seeds, feeling as if the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand. In that moment, I faced an impossible choice: sign away my autonomy to keep peace with my only child, or fight and potentially lose him forever. The bronze plaque in the children's wing once read Margaret Turner Literacy Initiative. Established, now it stated simply, Literacy Initiative. Director James Wyatt. 17 years of my life, a program that raised reading scores by 37%, attributed to a man who'd been here 8 months. My fingers hovered over the smooth metal, feeling ghost impressions where my name had been. 3 distinct sensations washed over me, a hollowing beneath my ribs, as if someone had scooped out my insides, a tightening in my throat that made swallowing impossible, then a peculiar lightness in my limbs, as if I might float away, cease to exist just as my name had. "The fresh approach seems to be working already." Chairman Phillips appeared beside me, nodding approvingly. James has really revitalized the program. Numbers were stagnant before, but his metrics-driven methodology is just what we needed. Stagnant? The program I'd built had increased literacy rates by 37%. We'd received statewide recognition last year. I'd spent 4,389 hours developing it. My hands trembled, not with nervousness, but with a seismic anger I'd spent a lifetime suppressing. I designed this program, I said, my voice emerging quieter than intended, as it always did, every element of it. The metrics system James is using, I implemented that into. Phillips smiled with that particular blend of pity and dismissal reserved for women my age. Margaret, no one's questioning your contribution, but we need innovation, not maintenance. James brings fresh eyes. He patted my shoulder. Change can be difficult for people who've been around a long time. People who've been around a long time. As if my 32 years made me outdated furniture rather than the innovative force that built this library's reputation. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. Robert. Margaret. Meeting ran long. The Hendersons are coming for dinner. Joan mentioned shellfish last time. Do that pasta thing. Need me to pick up wine? No greeting. No question about whether I had plans. Just the assumption that I would adapt my existence around his. I had planned to review grant applications tonight. The deadline was Friday. I'll handle it, I replied, because I always did. Great. Oh, and I used the home equity line yesterday, signed papers for the boat with Charles. His guy gave us a deal we couldn't pass up. The world stopped. My hand froze on the car door. The home equity line, on our house. The house my library salary had made half the mortgage payments on for 27 years. You used the equity line. My voice emerged thin, stretched like overworn elastic. Without discussing it, it was time-sensitive, Margaret. The opportunity wouldn't wait. We've talked about a boat for years. We had never once talked about a boat. Not once in 27 years. How much? The question emerged as a whisper. Don't worry about it. I've got it covered with the bonus from the Carson case. The Carson case, the one built on my research. Behind my closed eyes flashed the 2,800 hours of historical document analysis. The late nights pulling precedents, creating the evidence chains Robert presented in court. My unpaid labor, $156,000 of unacknowledged contribution. I need to know how much, Robert. $70,000. But like I said, it's covered. $70,000 without a conversation, without acknowledging the house was half mine. The Hendersons will be there at 7, he continued. Oblivious. Don't make that face you made at the Gregorys. Charles noticed. That face. My natural expression when exhausted. The library's annual report lay on the passenger seat. I picked it up with trembling hands, flipping to the community programs section, the section I had authored for 15 years. My name wasn't there. Not once in 23 pages. Programs I had created, statistics I had compiled, successes I had engineered, all attributed to the leadership team, or specifically to James Wyatt. With crystal clarity, I saw the pattern. The library board erasing my professional contributions, Robert claiming my research as his own. My daughter Emily, who last weekend had casually told her fiancé, Mom's always been content in the background. Some women aren't built for the spotlight. I wasn't in the background. I was the foundation. The invisible architecture, carrying the weight while remaining unseen. First the dismissal, then the replacement, now the erasure. The collection was complete. My fingers found the edge of the report, tracing the perfect binding. Like everything I touched, it was meticulously organized, precisely ordered. James had called it being stuck in the past. Robert dismissed it as Margaret's filing hobby, but they had never looked closely enough to see what I was really building all these years. Not just files. Evidence, documentation, blueprints of authorship, they couldn't deny if they actually looked. Some things can't be restored once they've been damaged. People should remember that when they build their success on someone else's silent labor. What happens when the invisible architect finally unfolds her blueprints for all to see? The morning after discovering Craig's betrayal, I sat in my car in the high school parking lot, knuckles white against the steering wheel. I wasn't due at the literacy program meeting for 30 minutes, but I needed this sanctuary, this familiar space where I'd parked for 3 decades of teaching. I still remember my first day at Oak Ridge High in 1987. Navy blazer with shoulder pads, leather briefcase from James, my classroom confidence booster, weighted with 28 ungraded essays. I'd practiced my teacher stance in our bedroom mirror, shoulders back, chin parallel to floor, voice from the diaphragm. "You've got this, Viv," James had said, straightening my collar. "Those kids don't stand a chance against your Shakespeare." The memory of his touch sent an ache through my chest. James had been gone 15 years, but in crises I still felt his absence like a physical hollowing. I forced myself to breathe deeply, focus on facts. Facts were steady when emotions weren't. Fact: I had taught English literature and contract law to over 4,000 students across 32 years. Fact: I had paid off our $287,000 mortgage completely 3 years before retirement. Fact: I had declined the department head position 3 times, forfeiting approximately $148,000 in additional earnings to maintain flexibility while raising Craig alone after James died. Fact: my son was now conspiring to move me into assisted living at 67 and sell my home without my consent. I traced the worn ridges of my classroom keys, still carried out of habit, though I'd retired 2 years ago. The metal was cold against my fingertips, grounding me while everything else seemed to float away. The faculty parking lot had always been my transition space, where Mom became Mrs. Reynolds and back again. Now it sheltered me as I tried to understand how my relationship with Craig had deteriorated so completely. 8 years ago, Craig brought Nicole home for Thanksgiving. I'd spent 3 days preparing, polishing my mother's silver, baking Craig's favorite pumpkin bread, arranging garden flowers on the table. Nicole had smiled thinly when shown the guest room. "You still use floral bedspreads?" she'd asked, fingering the quilt I'd chosen to match the curtains. My mother just redecorated our guest suite with a minimalist theme, so much cleaner looking. It was the first of many comparisons, subtle indicators that my home, my efforts, my life were lacking in Nicole's estimation. Craig had once defended me. Gradually, he began echoing her sentiments. Last Christmas, he watched me searching for misplaced reading glasses before opening gifts. "Mom, that's the 3rd time this week," he'd said, exchanging a meaningful glance with Nicole. "Maybe we should start keeping track of these episodes." Episodes. As if momentary forgetfulness at my age warranted clinical monitoring. The Parent-Teacher Association meeting was scheduled for 4:30. I arrived early to arrange materials for the literacy program I'd developed since retirement. Industrial cleaner couldn't mask the smell of fish sticks and overcooked broccoli. Some things about schools never changed. Halfway through my presentation, Craig's voice cut across the room. "What Mom means to say," he announced, rising from his seat, "is that she'd like to volunteer, but her schedule is getting full with doctor's appointments." The weight of his hand landed on my shoulder, pressing down, his palm burning through my blouse. He squeezed slightly, affectionate, yet controlling. 23 pairs of eyes shifted, many belonging to former students now seeing me as diminished, broken, incapable. The cold metal of the folding chair pressed against my back as whispers rippled through the room. I had invested $12,800 of my own money into curriculum materials and spent 4 months developing this program without compensation. The binder before me contained detailed lesson plans, assessment rubrics, resource lists, evidence of a mind that remained sharp and creative. Rather than protest, I straightened my spine and remained silent, letting awkwardness fill the room. My eyes stayed focused while Craig's left eye twitched slightly. His fingers drummed against his thigh, a nervous habit since childhood. The silence stretched until people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Principal Melissa Chen, my former student from '98, cleared her throat. Actually, we were hoping Mrs. Reynolds would lead this initiative, given her expertise. Several heads nodded agreement. Craig's face flushed, red climbing from neck to hairline. Well, of course, if she feels up to it, he backpedaled, voice strained. We just worry about her taking on too much at her age. After the meeting, I watched others being invited for coffee in the teacher's lounge. No one extended the invitation to me, despite my 3 decades in that very building. I sat alone in the cafeteria as chairs were folded around me. Later in my car, I allowed myself one moment of vulnerability, a single tear tracking down my cheek as I whispered, 32 years, and he sees nothing. My hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened, physical pain anchoring me when everything else seemed to float away. The garden had always been my sanctuary. When James was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I retreated there after hospital visits, hands working soil, while my heart processed the unthinkable. During those 3 years, I spent 6,240 hours caring for him while teaching full-time. The garden became my therapy, my meditation. After he died, 15-year-old Craig and I established a routine. Sunday mornings were for gardening, me tending plants, him reluctantly mowing. He complained but showed up, and back then, showing up mattered more than enthusiasm. "Why do you spend so much time on these plants?" he'd asked once, wiping sweat from his forehead. "They're just going to die when winter comes anyway." "Some will," I replied, carefully dividing a perennial's roots. "But the strongest ones adapt. They go dormant, conserving energy deep inside where you can't see it. Then they return, often stronger than before." He had rolled his eyes, typical teenage response. Now I wondered if he had ever really heard me. The Sunday garden tradition faded after college. When he married Nicole, I hoped it might resume, perhaps with grandchildren. Instead, Sunday visits became increasingly infrequent, and when they occurred, they were inspections rather than connections. "Mom, this garden is getting to be too much for you," Craig said during one visit last summer. "You should hire someone or just let it go. It's not like you're growing food here," but I was. Among the flowers were carefully cultivated herbs, heirloom tomatoes, and experimental hybrids, drought-resistant varieties adapted to changing climate conditions. My garden journal, which Craig dismissed as a hobby diary, contained detailed data on generations of crossbreeding and adaptation. "It keeps me active," was all I said, knowing he wouldn't understand. The garden wasn't just plants, it was continuity, contribution, creation. In retirement, it had become my second classroom, where I taught neighborhood children about sustainability, where I conducted quiet experiments that even my scientific gardening forum online had begun to notice. Nicole rarely entered the garden. "The pollen," she would explain, waving a manicured hand dismissively while remaining on the patio, "and all those insects." She pronounced the word as if describing vermin rather than essential pollinators. I didn't correct her. Corrections were interpreted as confrontations, and confrontations led to those meaningful glances between her and Craig, the ones that communicated difficult, confused, declining. The morning of the literacy program meeting, I watched younger teachers arrive through my windshield. Principal Chen spotted my car and walked toward me. I quickly wiped my eyes and straightened my posture, muscle memory of professional composure taking over. By the time she reached my window, I had transformed back into Mrs. Reynolds, English department veteran. "Vivian," she said warmly as I stepped out. "I'm glad you're early. I wanted to apologize for what happened at the PTA meeting." Craig shouldn't have spoken over you like that. It's becoming a pattern, I admitted, surprising myself with the confession. Melissa's eyes narrowed, her head tilting in a way that reminded me of her teenage self contemplating a complex passage. Has he always been this controlling? I supplied. No, this is relatively new. Since I retired, really. She nodded thoughtfully. My mother experienced something similar with my brother. After my father died, my brother suddenly decided she couldn't manage her finances, despite handling them successfully for 40 years. The parallel sent a chill through me. What happened? She let him take over, Melissa said simply. She thought it was easier than fighting. 3 years later, she had to sell her house because he mismanaged everything so badly. She lives with me now. The warning hung between us. Unspoken, but clear. The literacy program is excellent, Melissa continued. The board was impressed with the assessment metrics. We'd like to implement it district-wide if you're willing to train team leaders. The offer of meaningful work based on my expertise, my decades of experience, felt like oxygen after months of suffocation. I'd be honored, I said. Voice steady for the first time in weeks. As we walked toward the building, Melissa added casually, my mother finally got legal help to regain control of her affairs. I can give you her attorney's information, just in case it's ever useful. Our eyes met briefly, female solidarity across a generation gap, before returning to curriculum discussion. The weight of her unspoken understanding became a counterbalance to the burden I'd been carrying. That evening, I sat alone in my garden as twilight settled over the plants. The scent of soil and green things filled my nostrils, but instead of comfort, it brought a constriction in my throat, a tightness in my chest. For the first time, I fully felt the betrayal. My body shook. Not the slight, age-related tremor in my hands, but a profound, core-deep trembling rising from the earth itself. I grasped the garden fence to stay upright, physical pain grounding the emotional maelstrom. One sob escaped, then another, until I heaved with the force of contained grief, finally breaking through. I had raised Craig alone after James died, working full-time while attending every soccer game, helping with every school project, nursing him through illnesses and heartbreaks. I had sacrificed career advancement for flexibility, supported his education, welcomed his wife despite her contempt, and now he saw me as an inconvenient responsibility, a problem to solve, an asset to manage, a burden to place elsewhere. As darkness fell, I gradually regained composure. My hands, buried in soil beside a lavender plant, slowly steadied. The scent, which James had always said reminded him of our honeymoon, filled my senses, bringing strange clarity. In my classroom, I had never tolerated disrespect, never allowed students to diminish one another, never permitted dignity to erode. Why then had I allowed it in my own home, from my own This isn't just about plants, I whispered to the garden, echoing words once spoken to Craig. This is about recognizing that age doesn't diminish value, that wisdom gathered over decades isn't confusion, that a mother doesn't become property to be managed at retirement. I didn't yet know how to address Craig's betrayal, but sitting there in darkness, soil beneath my fingernails, I made a silent promise to the garden. To James's memory and to myself, I would not be erased from my own life. The chalk on blackboard sound of cicadas filled the night air, the classroom keys in my pocket pressed cold against my thigh, metallic reminders of authority I had once wielded without question. Tomorrow, I would begin finding my voice again. 3 days after discovering the realtor in my living room, I stood in Ellen's kitchen, clutching a mug of cooling tea. Her tablet lay between us, open to a real estate website. I thought you might want to see this, Ellen said gently. It popped up in my feed since I've been looking at downsizing options. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. My house, my home, displayed in professional photographs I hadn't authorized. Coming soon, charming 3-bedroom in desirable school district. Current owner relocating to assisted living. The mug slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the counter and sending hot liquid across my lap. I didn't even feel the burn, the inner cold of betrayal already numbing my skin. "Vivian?" Ellen's voice seemed distant. "Should I call someone?" "No," I managed, though speaking felt like pushing words through gravel. "I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. This wasn't just boundary crossing. This was theft of my home, my autonomy, my very selfhood. The spot where James's hospital bed had stood, where I'd held his hand as he took his final breath, was now staged with a decorative accent chair no one would ever sit in. "When was this listed?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Yesterday," Ellen replied, watching me carefully. "I assumed you knew." I shook my head once. My chest felt hollow yet impossibly heavy. My fingertips tingled with pins and needles, shock radiating through my system. The 6-minute walk home became an eternity. Each step seemed both weightless and leaden. The familiar streets, where I'd walked for 3 decades, suddenly felt like foreign territory. When I reached my driveway, I saw Craig's car parked in front. My hand instinctively found the classroom keys in my pocket, fingers worrying their ridged edges as they had during countless difficult parent conferences. I paused at my garden gate, drawing strength from the plants I had nurtured from seeds. "You faced classrooms full of teenagers for 32 years, I whispered to myself. "You can face this." Craig sat at my dining room table, papers spread before him, Nicole beside him scrolling through her phone. They looked up when I entered, his expression immediately concerned, hers briefly irritated before composing into politeness. "Mom," Craig began, rising. "We've been calling you. Where were you?" "At Ellen's," I replied, noting how they'd made themselves at home without waiting. "She showed me something interesting, the listing for my house." Craig and Nicole exchanged that micro-coordinated glance I'd come to recognize. My son sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We were going to discuss this with you tonight," he said. "You're jumping to conclusions again." "Am I?" I moved to the table and turned one of the papers toward me. Oak Ridge Assisted Living Stationery, payment receipt for a $3,000 non-refundable deposit. "Because it seems quite conclusive." Nicole cleared her throat. "Vivian, we've discussed this several times. You agreed that assisted living would be best given your episode." That word again. Episodes. As if occasional forgetfulness constituted a diagnosis. "I have never agreed to move to assisted living," I said, my voice dropping to the lower register I had once used to quiet unruly classrooms. "Not once. Not ever." Craig took my arm, guiding me to a chair as if I were infirm. "Mom, this is exactly what we mean. You don't remember our conversations about this." 3 separate discussions over the past month. The gaslighting hit me physically, like the floor dropping away. I knew with absolute certainty that no such discussions had ever taken place. They were creating a fiction of my mental decline to justify taking control. I looked around my dining room with new eyes. The family photos, the china cabinet filled with my mother's dishes, the marks on the doorframe showing Craig's childhood height. Every inch contained my history, my identity. "I'm not confused," I said finally, "and I'm not selling my house." Craig crouched beside my chair, taking my hands in his, a gesture once comforting but now condescending. "Mom, this is happening. The sooner you accept it, the easier the transition will be. We've already consulted with Dr. Hemmings about your condition." "My condition?" My voice hardened. What condition would that be, exactly? Nicole interjected, her tone carrying the careful patience used with difficult children. "Dr. Hemmings agreed that your cognitive fluctuations warrant supervised living. Craig has the documentation for the guardianship filing if necessary." Guardianship. The word landed like a physical blow. They weren't just trying to move me. they were preparing to legally strip me of my autonomy if I resisted. For 32 years, I had maintained control of classrooms filled with hormonal teenagers. I had managed department budgets, graded thousands of papers, coordinated curriculum. Since retirement, I had developed literacy programs, maintained my home and garden, balanced my accounts, created a life of meaningful contribution. Yet here sat my son and his wife, calmly discussing removing my legal right to make my own decisions. I felt something shift inside me, a tectonic movement deep in my core. The hollow sensation in my stomach transformed into heat, spreading upward through my chest. My spine straightened imperceptibly, shoulders squaring slightly. "I'd like to see these cognitive assessments," I said, voice steady. "And I'd like to know when Dr. Hemmings examined me, since I haven't seen him in over 8 months for anything other than a routine blood pressure check." Craig's left eye twitched, his childhood tell when caught in a lie. He reviewed the documentation we provided. "Documentation you provided," I repeated. "Records of my episodes that I don't remember having." "Exactly," Nicole said, as if I'd proven their point. "Memory gaps are the primary concern." I stood abruptly, causing Craig to step back. "I'm going to make some tea, and then we're going to have a very different conversation than the one you planned." In the kitchen, with the door pushed mostly closed, I leaned against the counter. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear or age, but from pure, clarifying anger. I reached for my phone and did something I'd seen my students do countless times, but had rarely done myself. I recorded. With the phone still running, I slipped it into my cardigan pocket before carrying the tea tray back. "Craig," I began, setting down the tea with the steady hands that had served classroom demonstrations for decades. "Nicole, when exactly did my cognitive decline begin?" Craig stirred sugar into his tea. "It's been gradual, Mom. The forgotten appointments, the misplaced keys, the stove burner left on." I nodded thoughtfully. "And these incidents, you've documented them?" "Of course," Nicole replied. "We have a log going back almost a year." I sipped my tea, processing this revelation. They had been building a case against me for a year, cataloging normal aging moments as evidence of incompetence. The betrayal was even deeper than I'd realized. "I see," I said, setting down my cup with deliberate care. "And have you shared this documentation with anyone else in the family? With Ruth, perhaps?" My question revealed another truth through their micro-expressions. The slight widening of Nicole's eyes, the momentary tightening of Craig's jaw. They had been spreading their narrative about my decline, isolating me from potential allies. "Aunt Ruth is concerned too," Craig confirmed. "She agrees this is the best solution." I allowed my teacher's pause to fill the room. 20 seconds of silence that made Craig shift uncomfortably and Nicole check her watch twice. "Let me present you with a choice," I finally said. "Either we cancel the house listing immediately and end all discussion of assisted living, or I will seek an independent cognitive assessment and legal counsel regarding your actions. Which would you prefer?" Craig's face flushed, color rising from his collar to his hairline. "Mom, you're being ridiculous. This is exactly the kind of irrational reaction that concerns us." "Is it irrational to defend my autonomy? To question why my son is selling my home without my consent?" My voice remained calm, measured, the voice that had maintained order through decades of teaching. Those seem like entirely rational concerns to me. Nicole's phone chimed. She glanced at it, then stood abruptly. The realtor needs a response about the virtual tour scheduling. She says there's already significant interest based on the listing photos. Something in me snapped, not toward hysteria, but toward absolute clarity. "There will be no virtual tour," I stated, rising to my full height. "And you will both leave my house now." Craig stood as well, towering over me, as he had since adolescence. "Mom, you need to calm down and listen to reason." "No, Craig. For once, you need to listen." I held his gaze steadily. I taught contract law for 15 years. I know my rights regarding my property and my person. What you're doing isn't just morally wrong. Parts of it are legally questionable. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, the first crack in his certainty. We're trying to help you. If you truly want to help me, start by respecting my decisions about my own life. Nicole huffed impatiently. This is getting us nowhere. Craig, we need to discuss the guardianship option with the attorney. She's clearly not capable of rational decisions anymore. The word guardianship hung between us, their nuclear option. I faced an impossible choice: surrender my autonomy voluntarily or have it stripped from me based on manufactured evidence of incompetence. Or so it seemed. After they left, Craig, with promises to discuss this when you're calmer, and Nicole with barely concealed frustration, I sat in my garden as twilight settled. The scent of soil and growing things filled my nostrils, grounding me when everything else seemed uncertain. Instead of despair, I felt a strange, energizing clarity. I played back the recording on my phone, confirming what I already knew. I had evidence of their gaslighting, their admission of creating documentation without my knowledge, their discussion of proceedings against me. I hadn't taught contract law and guided students through mock trials for nothing. I understood burden of proof, documentation requirements, and legal standards for determining competence. Most importantly, I understood that paper trails matter. That evening, I took 3 decisive actions. First, I called Melissa Chen and asked for the attorney contact she had mentioned. Second, I logged into my computer and began documenting everything, creating timeline notes, saving emails, photographing my organized bill payment system, and balanced checkbook. I had adapted to digital record keeping years ago, maintaining cloud backups of important documents, a fact Craig had overlooked in his assessment of my capabilities. Third, I scheduled a comprehensive cognitive assessment with geriatric specialists. If Craig wanted to claim I was incompetent, I would have expert testimony to the contrary. As I worked, a weight lifted from my shoulders. My fingers moved steadily over the keyboard, no longer trembling. My breathing deepened. The hollow sensation in my stomach gave way to hardening resolve. I had spent decades nurturing others, students, my husband through illness, my son into adulthood. I had proudly stepped back to let Craig build his own life, never interfering even when I disagreed. I had welcomed Nicole despite her contempt, maintained peace at family gatherings, swallowed corrections when they spoke over me. All along, I thought I was being supportive. Instead, I had trained them to see me as secondary, dispensable, less than. I had watered the seeds of my own erasure. Not anymore, I whispered to the garden, that had witnessed my tears, joy, and solitary perseverance after James died. This ends now. The chalk on blackboard sound of evening cicadas filled the air as I worked past midnight. The classroom keys rested beside my keyboard, no longer cold against my fingers, but warming with purpose. Before sleeping, I noticed something had changed in my reflection. A straightening of the spine, a squaring of shoulders I hadn't realized had begun to curve. The physical diminishment I had unconsciously adopted in Craig's presence was beginning to reverse. I thought of my garden, how perennials appeared to die in winter only to return stronger in spring. The strongest ones adapt, I had once told Craig. They go dormant, conserving energy deep inside where you can't see it. Then they return, often stronger than before. Perhaps it was time for my own emergence from dormancy. A week later, I sat in a medical office completing a comprehensive cognitive assessment. Dr. Sawyer, a woman with salt and pepper hair and tortoiseshell glasses, reviewed the results. "Well, Mrs. Reynolds, I have good news," she said, looking up from her tablet. "Your cognitive function is above average for your age bracket. In fact, you scored higher than most of my 40-year-old patients. Warmth spread through my chest, replacing the cold numbness that had resided there since discovering the realtor in my living room. "That's somewhat validating to hear," I said carefully. Dr. Sawyer's eyes narrowed slightly. "May I ask why you requested such a comprehensive evaluation?" "These tests are typically ordered when there are significant concerns about cognitive decline." I explained Craig and Nicole's actions. The house listing, the assisted living deposit, the threatened guardianship proceedings. Dr. Sawyer's mouth tightened at the corners. "Unfortunately, I see this situation more often than I'd like. Adult children making decisions about their parents' lives without proper medical assessment. Is there documentation you can provide that would help me?" I asked. "Absolutely," she replied, already typing. "I'll prepare a comprehensive report addressing competency concerns. And Mrs. Reynolds," she added, meeting my eyes directly, "should you need me to testify regarding your capacity, I would be happy to do so." As I left the medical building, sunlight warming my face, I felt stronger than I had in weeks. My phone pinged with a message from Devon Michaels, the attorney Melissa had recommended. "Records received. Meeting confirmed for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bring property deed and any communication regarding house listing." The message represented something profound: alliance, validation, a path forward. That afternoon, I drove to Oak Ridge Nursery, where Martin Okafor greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Reynolds, those hybrid lavender cuttings you shared last season have thrived beautifully, very drought-resistant, just as you predicted." I smiled, touching the sprig of lavender in my pocket. "I'm glad to hear it. Actually, I wanted to discuss something about my hybrids." I explained my years of careful crossbreeding, the detailed garden journal Craig had dismissed as a hobby diary, the drought-resistant varieties I'd developed through patient experimentation. Martin flipped through my leather-bound notebook with increasing animation, occasionally murmuring technical terms or nodding appreciatively. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said finally, looking up with newfound respect, "this isn't just gardening. This is legitimate botanical development. These propagation notes are more systematic than many professional growers I know." Something shifted in my chest, a physical sensation of expansion, of taking up space I'd been gradually ceding. "Your drought-resistant lavender hybrid alone could be commercially valuable," Martin continued. "With climate conditions changing, resilient ornamentals are in high demand. Would you consider allowing us to propagate some of these varieties?" "You mean, sell them?" "With proper attribution, of course. The Reynolds method, perhaps." His excitement was genuine. "We'd need to discuss terms, licensing, royalty." "Royalties?" I echoed, the concept foreign in connection with my hobby. Martin named a figure that made me grip the counter for support: $45,000. For plants I had developed in my backyard, with knowledge accumulated over decades, with patience and observation skills honed through teaching. As I drove home, a strange laugh escaped me, part disbelief, part vindication. The garden Craig had dismissed as too much for me, the documentation he'd called a hobby diary, the expertise he considered obsolete, all had tangible financial value that others recognized immediately. The hollow feeling in my stomach had completely transformed into a solid core of certainty. My knowledge had market value. My expertise had commercial application. My hobby represented intellectual property. "You mistook my kindness for weakness, my patience for confusion, and my silence for consent," I whispered, the words forming with a rhythm and clarity that felt like finding my true voice after years of muting it. Today that silence ends. The path forward wasn't yet clear in all its details, but the direction was certain. I would reclaim my narrative, my home, my autonomy, and in doing so, perhaps I would teach my son one final, crucial lesson about respect, about recognition, about the dangerous folly of underestimating a woman who had commanded classrooms for 32 years. The scent of lavender filled the car as I drove home, no longer triggering memories of loss but heralding possibility. The morning after meeting with Martin Okafor, I drafted an email to the realtor listed on my home's unauthorized listing, a sense of purpose straightening my spine. Please be advised that I, Vivian Reynolds, the sole legal owner of the property at 1842 Maple Avenue, have not authorized any listing, sale, or showing of my home. Any claim to the contrary is false. I request immediate removal of this listing from all platforms. I attached my property deed with my attorney's contact information. The decisive click of the send button felt like the first step I should have taken weeks ago. Next, I pulled out the garden journal Martin had admired. For years, I had meticulously documented my plant experiments, cross-pollination attempts, growth rates, soil compositions, but Martin had seen what Craig could not: methodology, consistency, innovation. He recognized the value of patient observation, skills I had honed through decades of teaching. I began a different documentation, cataloging every instance of Craig's dismissive behavior and Nicole's condescension. As I wrote, I realized how gradually their behavior had escalated, small corrections becoming outright dismissals, suggestions growing into unilateral decisions. Like temperature rising 1 degree at a time, I hadn't noticed the dangerous heat until nearly burned. My phone rang. The realtor's name appeared on screen. "Mrs. Reynolds," she began, tone professionally neutral but strained. "I've received your email regarding the listing of your property." "And?" I prompted when she paused. There seems to be some confusion. Your son assured me you had agreed to this arrangement." "There is no confusion on my part," I replied, my teacher's voice emerging naturally calm, authoritative. "I have not agreed to sell my home. I have not authorized any listing. I have not consented to relocate to assisted living." "I see." Her hesitation suggested reconsideration. "In that case, I'll need to speak with your son about this misunderstanding." "You're welcome to do so, but I should inform you that I've engaged legal counsel. Any continued attempt to list my property without consent could constitute a violation of real estate ethics codes." After ending the call, I sat motionless as tension released from my shoulders. The classroom keys beside my laptop caught the morning light. I picked them up, feeling their familiar weight. For 32 years, these keys had represented my authority, my expertise. Somewhere along the way, I had surrendered that authority in my personal life. "Not anymore," I whispered. Devin Michael's law office was housed in a converted Victorian, warm and professional. The attorney herself defied stereotypes with a ready smile that reminded me of my most promising students. "Your case is unfortunately common," she said, reviewing my documentation. "Adult children deciding they know what's best for their parents, often with financial motivations they don't fully acknowledge." I felt that familiar constriction in my throat. "Do you think this is about my house? About money?" In my experience, it's rarely just about assets. It's about control, about adult children struggling to accept that parents age without necessarily declining in capacity. She tapped my cognitive assessment results. "These results are excellent, by the way. Well above average." "So what do we do now?" I asked. "First, we secure your immediate autonomy. I'll draft cease and desist letters regarding the house listing and assisted living arrangements. Regarding their $3,000 non-refundable deposit at Oak Ridge, that was not your financial responsibility. We'll clarify that in writing. And the guardianship threat? Preventative measures. We'll create an advance directive and durable power of attorney designating someone you trust, not your son, to make decisions if you ever become incapacitated." For the next hour, we built a protection strategy. With each decision, I felt my posture straightening, my voice strengthening from the hesitant tone I'd developed around Craig to something closer to my classroom authority. Near the end, Devin asked, "What do you want your relationship with your son to look like after this?" The question landed heavily. Did I want reconciliation? Estrangement? Something in between. I thought of Craig as a child, eager to show me science projects, his fierce hugs after his father died. Somewhere inside the man who had tried to sell my house was still that boy I had raised. I want him to see me, I said finally. Not as a problem to solve, or a burden to manage, but as a person deserving of basic respect. Then that's part of our goal too, Devon said simply. The garden was entering early summer abundance when Craig arrived unannounced, expression thunderous, waving his phone. Mom, what the hell did you do? The realtor just called me. The listing's been pulled. I rose slowly, brushing soil from my hands. The old anxiety fluttered in my chest, that instinct to placate. I took a deep breath. Yes, I said simply. I had it removed since I never authorized it. Craig's face flushed. We discussed this. You agreed? No, I interrupted, voice firm but controlled. We never discussed it, and I never agreed. You made decisions about my home without my consent. This is exactly why we need to make these arrangements, he said, exasperation evident. Your memory is excellent, I finished. According to the comprehensive cognitive assessment I completed yesterday, would you like to see the results? Something flickered across Craig's face. Surprise, perhaps uncertainty. What assessment? The one conducted by geriatric specialists that places my cognitive function above average for my age bracket. One test doesn't. Craig, I said, using my full teacher's voice. I know about the deposit at Oak Ridge Assisted Living. I know about the documentation you've been collecting. I know about the guardianship proceedings you were considering. His left eye twitched, his childhood tell when caught in a lie. Who have you been talking to? The better question is who I'll be talking to next. I've engaged an attorney. The unauthorized listing of my home, the assisted living arrangements made without my consent, these raise serious legal concerns. The word attorney landed like a physical blow. Craig took an involuntary step back. You've what? Mom, we're trying to help you, not fight you? Help would involve asking what I need, not deciding what's best for me without my input. I gestured to the garden. You see a burden I can't manage. Others see valuable work. Martin Okafor at the nursery has offered $45,000 for propagation rights to my drought-resistant hybrids. Craig's mouth fell open. $45,000. For plants? For years of methodical development, careful documentation, and expertise you dismissed as a hobby, I corrected. The garden journal you called a diary contains valuable intellectual property. Something shifted in Craig's expression, the first crack in his certainty. For a brief moment, I glimpsed the son who had once looked at me with respect. I didn't know, he said quietly. No, I agreed. Because you didn't ask, you observed, assumed, and acted, all without seeking my perspective. What happens now? He finally asked. Now we establish boundaries. You will not make decisions about my life without my consent. You will not discuss my cognitive status with others. You will not proceed with any arrangements regarding my home or care without my explicit agreement. He nodded slowly, processing this shift in our dynamic. The following week unfolded in deliberate actions. I finalized my advanced directive and durable power of attorney, naming Melissa Chen as my decision-maker should I ever become incapacitated. I signed the propagation agreement for my hybrid plants, with the $45,000 to be paid in installments plus ongoing royalties. I also began making subtle changes to my appearance. Muted cardigans gave way to jewel tones I had once favored in the classroom. I had my silver hair shaped into a defined bob, rather than the soft, forgettable style I had gradually adopted. You have beautiful bone structure, the stylist commented. Why hide it? Why indeed? I thought. When had I started making myself physically smaller? The woman in the mirror looked more like the teacher I had been, chin parallel to the floor, shoulders squared, eyes direct. At home, I reclaimed spaces I had subconsciously ceded. The dining room table, once covered with Craig and Nicole's paperwork, now held garden journals and propagation plans. The guest room received new curtains in a vibrant pattern I loved, rather than the neutral tones Nicole might have chosen. "You look different. Stronger somehow," Ellen observed over coffee on her patio. "I've been there. After Tom died, my son thought he needed to manage my finances. It's insidious how quickly we can be reduced from capable adults to problems requiring management." This solidarity strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just defending my own autonomy. I was pushing back against broader assumptions about aging, about womanhood, about whose expertise counts. I suggested Sunday dinner at a restaurant, I told Ellen. Neutral territory, public setting, Devon's advice. "Is reconciliation what you want?" Ellen asked gently. "I think I want the possibility," I said finally. Not immediate forgiveness, not pretending it never happened, but the possibility of something healthier. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, deliberately choosing a table in the center of the room. Public settings created accountability. When Craig and Nicole entered, I watched their approach with new awareness. Nicole's smile appeared fixed, professional rather than warm. Craig's posture suggested tension. "You look different," he said. "Thank you," I replied simply, not filling the silence with self-deprecation. After our entrees arrived, Craig cleared his throat. "Mom, about the house situation." "Yes," I interrupted calmly. "I've had the listing removed, as you know. We may have moved too quickly there." Without my knowledge or consent, I clarified, "That's not moving quickly, that's acting against my explicit wishes." Nicole's fingers tightened around her water glass. "Vivian, we were concerned. Your occasional confusion has been evaluated by medical professionals and found to be within normal parameters for my age," I finished. The cognitive assessment results were quite clear. I allowed a strategic pause, 20 seconds of quiet, that made Craig shift uncomfortably and Nicole check her watch twice. "I understand you believed you were acting in my best interest," I continued. "But good intentions don't justify removing my agency. What do you want from us, Mom? To pretend none of this happened?" Craig asked. "No, I want acknowledgement of the harm done. I want assurance it won't happen again. And I want a relationship built on mutual respect rather than assumption and control." By dessert, we had reached no dramatic reconciliation. Instead, we had something perhaps more valuable: clarity. I had articulated my boundaries. They had begun to recognize the impact of their actions. As we parted, Craig hesitated, then asked, "Will you tell me more about the plant thing, the hybrids the nursery wants?" The question, the first genuine interest he'd shown in my work in years, wasn't much, but it was something. "I'd like that," I said. "Perhaps you could visit the garden next week." That night, before my bedroom mirror, I noticed changes in my reflection. My posture was straighter, my gaze more direct, my shoulders level rather than hunched. "You've got this, Viv," I whispered, echoing James's words. But this time, the reassurance came from within, from the teacher who had commanded classrooms, the gardener who had created value through patient observation. I placed my classroom keys on the bedside table, now serving as a reminder rather than talisman. That certainty now lived inside me, growing stronger with each boundary established. The scent of lavender drifted through my open window, no longer triggering melancholy, but heralding possibility. Like my hybrid plants adapting to changing conditions, I was finding new ways to thrive, not despite age and challenge, but because of the wisdom they had granted me. "The strongest ones adapt," I had once told Craig. "They go dormant, conserving energy deep inside where you can't see it. Then they return, often stronger than before." It was time for my own return, my own flowering on my terms, in my season, in my garden. The Oak Ridge Community Center bustled with activity for the seasonal gardening showcase. Folding tables displayed local growers' specialties, heirloom vegetables, native plants, ornamental arrangements. Martin Okafor spotted me and waved. "Vivian, perfect timing. We've set up your station by the windows. Best light for showcasing those hybrids." I followed him to a prominent table where my drought-resistant lavender and other hybrid varieties were arranged with placards describing their development. "The Reynolds method," I read aloud, fingers tracing the embossed lettering. "Fitting, don't you think?" Martin smiled. "Your systematic approach deserves recognition." A small group had gathered, examining the plants with genuine interest, the sensation of being seen, truly seen, for my expertise, rather than dismissed for my age, created a warmth spreading through my chest. As I explained my hybridization techniques, I noticed Melissa Chen enter with several teachers from the literacy program committee. She caught my eye and smiled encouragingly. Midway through describing my drought adaptation experiments, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "Excuse me, sorry, that's my mother speaking." Craig pushed forward, Nicole a half step behind, both dressed with careful casualness. They hadn't been expected, not in this space I had carved out separate from their narrative about me. My words faltered briefly, my throat tightening. For a moment, I was transported back to the PTA meeting where Craig had interrupted my presentation, speaking over me as if I were already diminished. But this time was different. I stood surrounded by evidence of my continuing competence, plants I had developed, documentation I had maintained, an audience engaged with my expertise. I drew myself up to my full height, shoulders squared, chin parallel to the floor. As I was saying, I continued, voice steady. The cross-pollination process requires patience and systematic observation. Each generation is documented with specific attention to drought tolerance metrics. The audience nodded, several taking notes. Craig and Nicole hovered at the edges, neither acknowledged nor rejected as I continued. When the presentation concluded and people moved forward with questions, Craig approached. "Mom," he said quietly, "I had no idea your garden work was so technical." I met his gaze steadily. "There's quite a bit about me you've chosen not to see." Nicole stepped forward, practiced smile in place. "This is all very impressive, Vivian. Such a fulfilling hobby for someone your age." "Not a hobby," Martin interjected. "Mrs. Reynolds' hybrids represent significant horticultural development. The propagation rights agreement reflects their commercial value." Nicole's smile faltered. "Propagation rights?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "Martin's nursery is paying $45,000 for the right to commercially develop 4 of my drought-resistant varieties." The figure landed between us like a physical presence. Craig's expression cycled rapidly through surprise, disbelief, and something approaching respect. $45,000? Nicole repeated, voice higher than normal. "For plants?" "For intellectual property," Martin corrected. Years of methodical development documented with professional precision. The Reynolds method is already generating interest among growers facing climate adaptation challenges. Craig's face flushed, color rising from his collar. "Mom, why didn't you tell us about this?" The question hung in the air, so innocent on its surface, so revealing in its assumption that I owed him this information, that my achievements required his awareness to be valid. I allowed my teacher's pause to fill the space between us. 10 seconds. 15. Craig shifted his weight uncomfortably, while Nicole fidgeted with her watch. "You didn't ask," I said finally, voice quiet but carrying. "You were too busy documenting my supposed decline to notice my continued growth." Several people nearby glanced our way. Martin cleared his throat, offering an escape route. "Mrs. Reynolds, the newspaper photographer would like some images of you with the hybrids for next week's feature." As I moved toward the photographer, I heard Craig mutter to Nicole, "Did she say newspaper feature?" Their surprise didn't erase the deeper hurt of their betrayal, but it provided a counterbalance. Evidence that their narrative about me wasn't just wrong, but demonstrably publicly wrong. 3 days later, I sat in Devon Michael's office, reviewing the final paperwork for my advance directive and financial protection measures. "Everything looks in order," Devon said, handing me a pen. "With these documents filed, any attempt to pursue guardianship would face significant legal hurdles." As I signed each page, I felt a weightlifting protection against the threat Craig had wielded, security for my home and assets, assurance that my autonomy remained legally protected. "There's one more item we should discuss," Devon said, pulling out another folder. "The $3,000 non-refundable deposit Craig and Nicole made at Oak Ridge Assisted Living. The mention of that payment, made without my knowledge, leveraged as pressure, sent a chill through me, despite the warm office. Since you never authorized that expenditure, you're not legally responsible for it," Devon explained. "However, Oak Ridge is unlikely to refund it given their policy. This creates a situation where Craig and Nicole have effectively spent $3,000 on arrangements you never requested or agreed to. I considered this. They made that choice without consulting me. The financial consequence seems proportionate." Devon nodded. "I've drafted a letter clarifying that you will not be covering this expense, nor utilizing the services they attempted to secure on your behalf." As I signed this final document, I felt no vindictive satisfaction, only a steady certainty that boundaries have consequences, that actions should align with their natural results. My phone rang through the car's speaker as I drove home. Technology Craig assumed I couldn't navigate despite my having taught computer literacy workshops. "Mrs. Reynolds?" Martin's voice filled the car. "Great news! The newspaper feature is scheduled for this Sunday's Home and Garden section. They want additional photos of the drought-resistant herbs tomorrow." The public recognition of my work Craig and Nicole had dismissed as a hobby suitable for someone my age created a warm expansion in my chest. This wasn't just about plants. It was about being seen for my continuing competence and contribution. As I turned onto my street, I noticed Craig's silver sedan in my driveway. My hands tightened briefly on the steering wheel, old anxiety fluttering before being replaced by steady resolve. Craig stood on my porch, shifting his weight nervously as I approached. His left eye twitched slightly, that childhood tell that had never disappeared. "Mom," he said, "I hope it's okay that I stopped by. I tried calling, but it went to voicemail." "I was driving," I replied simply, unlocking my door without inviting him in or sending him away, a neutral position from which to assess his purpose. He followed me inside, hovering uncertainly in the entryway, a space he had once navigated with entitlement, now reframed as territory requiring permission. "I wanted to talk about Sunday," he said finally, "at the community center." I removed my jacket and turned to face him fully. "What about it? The plants? The nursery contract? The newspaper feature? Why didn't you tell us about any of this?" His tone had shifted, less accusatory, more genuinely puzzled. I chose directness over diplomacy. "Our recent interactions haven't exactly encouraged sharing, Craig. You've dismissed my gardening as a hobby I should hire someone for or just let go. You've positioned me as declining, confused, incapable. Why would I discuss my achievements with someone so committed to seeing my deficits?" He flinched, as if my words carried physical force, color rising from his collar to his hairline. "That's not fair. We were concerned about your well-being." "Were you?" I asked quietly. "Or were you concerned about managing what you perceived as a problem? Because genuine concern involves conversation, not unilateral decisions made without my knowledge or consent." For perhaps the first time, he seemed to be truly hearing me, rather than formulating his next argument. Over tea, Craig examined the framed certificate on the side table. "My Teaching Excellence Award from..." "I remember this," he said. "Your students created that video tribute. You cried when they played it at the ceremony. They spoke about how I believed in them when others didn't. I said softly, how I saw potential where others saw problems. The irony hung between us, unspoken but palpable. "Mom," he began after a long silence, "I received a letter from your attorney today about the Oak Ridge deposit. The letter states that you won't be covering that expense since you never authorized it." "That's correct," I confirmed calmly. Craig's jaw tightened. "That's a significant amount of money." "It is," I agreed. "A significant amount spent on arrangements I never requested, agreed to, or needed." "We were trying to help you," he insisted, though with diminished conviction. "Help would have involved asking what I needed," I replied, "not deciding what was best for me without my input." Craig stared into his tea. "So what happens now? With us, I mean." "That depends," I said. "Are you willing to see me as I am, not as you've decided I must be? Can you accept that I remain capable of managing my own life, making my own decisions, contributing in meaningful ways?" He looked up, meeting my gaze directly perhaps, for the first time since this conflict began. "The plants, your hybrids, they really are extraordinary." Martin explained how few people successfully develop climate-adaptive varieties. "You did that in our backyard." It wasn't quite an answer to my question, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement of my competence in one domain at least. "I did," I confirmed, "just as I taught for 32 years, raised you alone after your father died, and maintained this home through careful financial management. My capabilities didn't suddenly evaporate when I reached retirement age." He flinched slightly but nodded. "I think maybe we saw what we expected to see." The occasional memory lapses seemed more significant because they fit our narrative. "Confirmation bias," I said, the teacher in me automatically naming the cognitive pattern. A ghost of a smile touched Craig's lips. "You never stop teaching, do you?" "Why would I?" I returned, the smile briefly. "It's been my life's work." The tension between us had shifted, not dissolved entirely, but transformed into something less brittle. Craig leaned forward slightly. "I owe you an apology, Mom. A real one, not a justification disguised as remorse." He took a deep breath. "I'm sorry for making decisions about your life without your consent, for dismissing your capabilities, for treating you as a problem to manage rather than a person to respect." The words, so simple, so necessary, landed like rain on parched soil. Not enough to heal all damage, but enough to allow the possibility of new growth. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means a great deal to me." "The attorney's letter about the Oak Ridge deposit, is that non-negotiable?" I recognized the question as both practical inquiry and test of my boundaries. "Yes," I said firmly. "Actions have consequences, Craig. You and Nicole chose to make that payment without my knowledge or consent. The financial impact is yours to address, not mine." He exhaled slowly, accepting this with a nod. "That's fair. Uncomfortable, but fair." The community board meeting room at the library was filled beyond capacity the following week. Extra chairs accommodated the overflow crowd, creating narrow pathways between seated attendees. In the back row sat Craig, alone, his expression unreadable from this distance. Melissa Chen approached as I found my seat. "Quite a turnout. Your newspaper feature generated significant interest in the literacy garden proposal. The Home and Garden article, featuring my hybrid plants, development methodology, and vision for educational applications, had generated unexpected community response. What had begun as plant recognition had evolved into broader interest in my integrated garden literacy program." The board chairperson called the meeting to order. "Our first agenda item tonight is the proposed community literacy garden program, developed by retired teacher Vivian Reynolds in partnership with Oak Ridge Nursery and the school district." As I rose to present, my teacher's posture emerged naturally, shoulders back, chin parallel to the floor, voice projected from the diaphragm. 32 years in Oak Ridge classrooms taught me that learning flourished. The Oak Ridge Community Center bustled with activity for the seasonal gardening showcase. Folding tables displayed local growers' specialties, heirloom vegetables, native plants, ornamental arrangements. Martin Okafor spotted me and waved. "Vivian, perfect timing. We've set up your station by the windows. Best light for showcasing those hybrids." I followed him to a prominent table where my drought-resistant lavender and other hybrid varieties were arranged with placards describing their development. "The Reynolds method," I read aloud, fingers tracing the embossed lettering. "Fitting, don't you think?" Martin smiled. "Your systematic approach deserves recognition." A small group had gathered, examining the plants with genuine interest, the sensation of being seen, truly seen. For my expertise, rather than dismissed for my age, created a warmth spreading through my chest. As I explained my hybridization techniques, I noticed Melissa Chen enter with several teachers from the literacy program committee. She caught my eye and smiled encouragingly. Midway through describing my drought adaptation experiments, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "Excuse me, sorry, that's my mother speaking." Craig pushed forward, Nicole a half-step behind, both dressed with careful casualness. They hadn't been expected, not in this space I had carved out separate from their narrative about me. My words faltered briefly, my throat tightening. For a moment, I was transported back to the PTA meeting where Craig had interrupted my presentation, speaking over me as if I were already diminished. But this time was different. I stood surrounded by evidence of my continuing competence, plants I had developed, documentation I had maintained, an audience engaged with my expertise. I drew myself up to my full height, shoulders squared, chin parallel to the floor. As I was saying, I continued, voice steady. The cross-pollination process requires patience and systematic observation. Each generation is documented with specific attention to drought tolerance metrics. The audience nodded, several taking notes. Craig and Nicole hovered at the edges, neither acknowledged nor rejected as I continued. When the presentation concluded and people moved forward with questions, Craig approached. "Mom," he said quietly, "I had no idea your garden work was so technical." I met his gaze steadily. "There's quite a bit about me you've chosen not to see." Nicole stepped forward, practiced smile in place. "This is all very impressive, Vivian. Such a fulfilling hobby for someone your age." "Not a hobby," Martin interjected. "Mrs. Reynolds' hybrids represent significant horticultural development. The propagation rights agreement reflects their commercial value." Nicole's smile faltered. "Propagation rights?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "Martin's nursery is paying $45,000 for the right to commercially develop 4 of my drought-resistant varieties." The figure landed between us like a physical presence. Craig's expression cycled rapidly through surprise, disbelief, and something approaching respect. $45,000? Nicole repeated, voice higher than normal. "For plants?" "For intellectual property," Martin corrected. Years of methodical development documented with professional precision. The Reynolds method is already generating interest among growers facing climate adaptation challenges. Craig's face flushed, color rising from his collar. "Mom, why didn't you tell us about this?" The question hung in the air, so innocent on its surface, so revealing in its assumption that I owed him this information, that my achievements required his awareness to be valid. I allowed my teacher's pause to fill the space between us. 10 seconds, 15. Craig shifted his weight uncomfortably, while Nicole fidgeted with her watch. "You didn't ask," I said finally, voice quiet but carrying. "You were too busy documenting my supposed decline to notice my continued growth." Several people nearby glanced our way. Martin cleared his throat, offering an escape route. "Mrs. Reynolds, the newspaper photographer would like some images of you with the hybrids for next week's feature." As I moved toward the photographer, I heard Craig mutter to Nicole, "Did she say newspaper feature?" Their surprise didn't erase the deeper hurt of their betrayal, but it provided a counterbalance. Evidence that their narrative about me wasn't just wrong, but demonstrably publicly wrong. 3 days later, I sat in Devon Michael's office, reviewing the final paperwork for my advance directive and financial protection measures. "Everything looks in order," Devon said, handing me a pen. "With these documents filed, any attempt to pursue guardianship would face significant legal hurdles." As I signed each page, I felt a weightlifting protection against the threat Craig had wielded, security for my home and assets, assurance that my autonomy remained legally protected. "There's one more item we should discuss," Devon said, pulling out another folder. "The $3,000 non-refundable deposit Craig and Nicole made at Oak Ridge Assisted Living. The mention of that payment, made without my knowledge, leveraged as pressure, sent a chill through me, despite the warm office. Since you never authorized that expenditure, you're not legally responsible for it," Devon explained. "However, Oak Ridge is unlikely to refund it given their policy. This creates a situation where Craig and Nicole have effectively spent $3,000 on arrangements you never requested or agreed to. I considered this. They made that choice without consulting me. The financial consequence seems proportionate." Devon nodded. "I've drafted a letter clarifying that you will not be covering this expense, nor utilizing the services they attempted to secure on your behalf." As I signed this final document, I felt no vindictive satisfaction, only a steady certainty that boundaries have consequences, that actions should align with their natural results. My phone rang through the car's speaker as I drove home. Technology Craig assumed I couldn't navigate despite my having taught computer literacy workshops. "Mrs. Reynolds?" Martin's voice filled the car. "Great news! The newspaper feature is scheduled for this Sunday's Home and Garden section. They want additional photos of the drought-resistant herbs tomorrow." The public recognition of my work Craig and Nicole had dismissed as a hobby suitable for someone my age created a warm expansion in my chest. This wasn't just about plants. It was about being seen for my continuing competence and contribution. As I turned onto my street, I noticed Craig's silver sedan in my driveway. My hands tightened briefly on the steering wheel, old anxiety fluttering before being. 6 months after the community board meeting, I stood at the gate of the Reynolds Literacy Garden. September sunshine filtered through oak leaves, casting dappled light across reading platforms and plant identification stations. "Nervous?" Melissa Chen asked, clipboard in hand. "Not nervous," I replied, smoothing my emerald green blouse, far from the muted cardigans I once hid within. Just taking it in. 6 months ago, this was just a concept in my garden journal. Now it was a thriving reality. Drought-resistant plants, with literary connections, reading nooks among native grasses, a small amphitheater for children's presentations. Officials, media, and community members gathered for the grand opening. "You've created something remarkable," Melissa said. "Something that will outlast all of us." The notion that my work would continue influencing children long after I was gone created warmth spreading through my chest. This wasn't just about plants or literacy, it was about legacy transcending age limitations. Martin approached with his tablet. "First commercial sales figures for your hybrids. 3 months on market. Demand increases weekly." These numbers reinforced what I'd begun to internalize. Expertise doesn't expire with retirement. Knowledge gathered over decades compounds rather than diminishes. I found myself standing straighter, chin parallel to the ground, shoulders squared, the posture I'd maintained through decades of teaching now fully reclaimed. "There's something different about you," my old department chair observed. "You seem expanded somehow." The word captured perfectly what had happened. I had expanded back into my full self after years of making myself smaller to accommodate others' perceptions. Craig set up chairs with other volunteers. Our relationship a work in progress, healing happening in small increments. He'd followed through on his construction offer, showing up reliably, listening more than speaking, observing my interactions with new awareness. "Mrs. Reynolds?" A young woman approached. "I'm Lucia Fernandez, from your English class 10 years ago. Of course I remember you. Your essay on Their Eyes Were Watching God remains one of the most insightful analyses I've read." Her face brightened. "I teach English now at Westside. Your literacy garden inspired me to start something similar with my 7th graders. Would you consider consulting on our project?" The request, professional recognition from a former student, created that sense of expansion again. This was what teaching had always been about. Knowledge flowing forward, wisdom shared across generations. "I'd be honored," I told her. Ellen introduced her sister Margaret, who said without preamble, "My son tried something similar to yours, using memory lapses to justify selling my condo. I didn't have your courage to fight back. Watching you stand up for yourself gives me strength." It wasn't just courage, I told her. It was connection, finding allies who saw my continuing value when family temporarily lost sight of it. Margaret nodded. Isolation makes us vulnerable in ways courage alone can't overcome. When I addressed the crowd, I stepped to the microphone with steady presence. 32 years in classrooms taught me that true education happens at intersections, I began. This garden represents that intersection where text meets soil, reading meets growing, observation meets imagination. Craig watched from the 3rd row, his expression a mixture of pride and reflection. Gardens teach patience and adaptation. Books teach empathy and perspective. Together, they offer children a richer understanding of both natural world and human experience. After the ceremony, Craig approached. "This is remarkable, Mom. You've integrated everything, plants, reading stations, layout into a coherent story. Teaching doesn't end with retirement," I replied. "It just finds new forms." "I've been thinking about perception," he continued. "I didn't see you clearly. I saw a narrative about aging and decline that fit my expectations rather than your reality." As we walked through the garden, I moved with steady confidence. My pace neither hurried to keep up nor slowed to accommodate. Near the herbs, Martin explained my hybrid to interested gardeners. The Reynolds method creates adaptive resilience through systematic crossbreeding. Craig listened intently. I never realized gardening involved so much science. I thought it was just puttering. "You missed a lot about who I am and what I contribute," I acknowledged. "Recognition can happen at any point," I added. "It's what we do after recognition that matters." Later, Lucia brought 2 middle school students with limited resources for their garden project. "Constraints foster creativity," I told them. "Some of my best classroom innovations came from having too few resources. The question isn't whether it's ideal, it's whether it's possible." Afterward, Lucia confided, "Watching you stand up to Craig showed me how to help my mother with my brother, who makes all her decisions." I recognized in her hunched shoulders my former posture, the physical diminishment, when accommodating others, minimizing perceptions. "Stand like this," I demonstrated, feet planted shoulder-width apart, spine straight, shoulders squared, chin parallel to the ground. "Our physical presence shapes how others perceive us," I explained. "But more importantly, it shapes how we experience ourselves." My son began making decisions about my life when I began physically shrinking in his presence. Understanding dawned in Lucia's eyes. "I do this with my department chair. I literally hunch over like I'm apologizing for existing. Our silence and posture teach others how to treat us," I said. "Sometimes the most powerful thing is simply taking up our full space and letting the resulting discomfort belong to those who expected our diminishment." As Lucia's shoulders straightened, I saw my own transformation reflected in someone 30 years younger. the intergenerational transmission of embodied confidence. At a twilight garden session, Nicole approached hesitantly, our first direct interaction in months. My mother suggested I try growing your hybrids for mindfulness practice, she explained, the admission costing her visible effort. The therapist recommended gardening for stress reduction. This request from the woman who had once dismissed my garden as an outdated hobby created a complex emotion. Not vindication exactly, nor forgiveness, but recognition of possibility. These varieties work well in containers, I explained, shifting into teaching mode. They require minimal watering once established. Would it be appropriate for me to attend your propagation workshop next week? She asked, acknowledging boundaries established, trust broken, not yet rebuilt. Yes, I said after careful consideration. The workshop is open to all community members. As she turned to leave, she hesitated. Your mother would be proud of you. This garden, the educational program, it's a significant contribution. 2 years after the realtor measured my living room, my garden literacy method was expanding to 3 additional school districts, with curriculum guides approved for nationwide distribution. Craig brought a potted plant from State University researchers interested in collaborating on drought-resistant hybrids. He delivered this information without qualification or management, no longer filtering my world or deciding what opportunities I should pursue, simply respecting my capacity to determine relevance. Nicole is pregnant, he told me over tea. We want you involved as a grandmother on terms that respect your independence and ongoing contributions. This clarification, so different from how he might have framed things 2 years ago, demonstrated our evolved relationship. The woman who had stood frozen as strangers measured her living room, now operated a nationally recognized educational program. The garden, once dismissed as a retirement hobby, generated income through commercial propagation. The mother, once positioned as declining, now consulted on curriculum development across multiple districts. Most significantly, I had evolved into someone who occupied her full space unapologetically, who recognized her continuing value without requiring external validation, who maintained boundaries without sacrificing connection. The scent of soil after spring rain no longer triggered memories of betrayal, but heralded continued possibility. The garden that witnessed my tears now witnessed my triumph, not as final destination, but as ongoing journey. You've got this, Viv, I whispered to myself, but this time, the reassurance required no external validation. This time, I knew with bone-deep certainty that I did, indeed, have this on my own terms, in my own season, in my own garden. The strongest ones adapt. They go dormant, conserving energy deep inside where you can't see it. Then they return, often stronger than before.